Hello, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Media Rumble, welcome to the 5th session of the Media Rumble Dispatches. TMR Dispatches is going to be a run-up to our annual event, the Media Rumble, which brings together leading news professionals, tech innovators, policymakers, filmmakers, and investors from across the world to discuss the future of news, technology that is associated with news, and policy. This is the 4th edition of TMR, slated for September 2020. It will be India's one of the first few digital-only media conferences. And from here on, every year, even post-COVID, we will have an online version of the Media Rumble. In the lead up to TMR at Online, Newslaundry and Teamwork Arts feature a new series called TMR Dispatches, which is what this is. Through this series, we can increase the scope and talking points that we can include at the Media Rumble. Our session for today is Hate News, brought to you by. With advertising comes great responsibility. Our panelists are Nandini Jammi, co-founder of Check My Ads and also co-founder of Sleeping Giants, and Richard Wilson, co-founder of Stop Funding Hate. Both of them have done some amazing work in trying to make sense or put some responsibility towards advertisers in the kind of programming that they fund. This is going to be moderated by Manisha Pande. She is the executive editor at Newslaundry. She reports, she edits, she has her own show, and she gets kicks out of watching television news. She has been with the Business Standard and DNA, and she's interested in the media and would like to tell stories that acquaint you with different aspects of the news industry. I'd also like this opportunity to thank our official partners for TMR. Do follow our social media handles, the Media Rumble on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and get notified on upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, the Media Rumble. Ladies and gentlemen, Hate News brought to you by, with great advertising comes great responsibility, moderated by Manisha Pande. All yours, Manisha.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Dispatches, which I am very excited about because this is a subject that I've been thinking a lot about and it's very close to my heart. So I think 45 minutes is going to be very less for speaking about this with Richard and Nandini both. Because in India, scrutinizing advertisements and scrutinizing brands from the lens of what they promote or from the lens of what they power with their money in terms of the news that we consume isn't really something that we've been talking about a lot. It's not something that an average Indian news consumer thinks about a lot. I want to begin the session with first just talking to Richard and Nandini about the stuff that they've been doing so that you guys get a little bit of a peek into the kind of campaign and work that they've been doing in the US and UK. So I want to start with Nandini. You've been in the digital tech ad space. I've read a couple of stories on you, one of which said that you started off with, reading a lot of content on Breitbart, which is a right-wing website in the US, and just looking at the sort of advertising that they were getting. And that's how you really started immersing yourself into questioning the sort of content that ads or brands end up promoting. Tell us a bit about how Sleeping Giant began. What made you get into this?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I didn't spend a whole lot of time reading about Breitbart or reading Breitbart. I had read about it and I went to visit the website on my own just to check it out after the elections of 2016. And I saw immediately, the first thing I noticed was that the website was plastered in ads for some of the biggest companies in the world. And I have a background in marketing. You don't have to be a genius to know that Google Ads, that this was powered by Google Ads. And so I immediately realized, or I made that connection that if the ad is appearing on there, that's, they're getting money for that. So every time you open up Breitbart or you interact with it or you click on the ad, Breitbart gets a couple of pennies to dollars or whatever. So I decided to sort of bring that to light. I wrote about how advertising funds organizations like this, started taking screenshots of those ads to let the companies know, because often when we do turn on our Google ads, we don't realize where our ads are going. Those ads are placed for us. So what I wanted to do was alert advertisers of the fact that their ads are appearing on sites like this, and then give them a chance to respond and to add that website to their exclusion list so that they wouldn't have to fund that anymore.
When you talk about organizations like this, I just wanted to clear up on what is the sort of content that you were flagging? What is it that you read or watched and thought, I mean, could you just break it up into like, define it for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So Breitbart is a propaganda site masquerading as news. So what they do is they write stories about current events that appear to be news on the outside to the unsuspecting reader, but they are in fact full of misleading claims, false claims, and they engage in hate speech, more specifically around xenophobia, homophobia, misogyny, sexism, and so on.
Okay. Richard, a UK tabloid is notorious the world over for the sort of stuff that it puts out, not just in terms of hate speech, but also salacious reporting. You founded Stop Hate in 2016. What made you get into this sort of space of advocacy where you were pressuring advertisers to relook the sort of stuff that they end up promoting?
Well, the starting point for us was there was a horrible spike in hate crime in Britain in the summer of 2016, particularly people who were taken to be born overseas were targeted, people from the Muslim community were targeted. And there was a real sense of shock that many of us had about the way that things were going, because like many people, I'd sort of grown up with the idea that as a society, we were moving away from the sort of racist ways of the past. And it was very clear that you know, a lot of this stuff was very much still here and getting worse. And a lot of experts have been warning for years that there's a link between the hate that we're seeing on our streets and the hate that we've been seeing in our media. And this spike in hate crime in the UK had been preceded by year after year of dozens of front page stories pushing really toxic messages, particularly about migrants. And in 2016 alone, there were over 100 UK newspaper front pages with negative messages about migrants. And so the sense was, you know, what can we do as ordinary people to try to challenge this? And I happened to be looking at a copy, I think it was the Sun newspaper, because I worked at an organization that got all of the newspapers every day. So they were all laid out in the kitchen. And I noticed that my phone company was advertising in this newspaper that was pushing these toxic stories. So I immediately started to think, well, that's who's funding it. And I was actually working in fundraising at the time. So I sort of had a mindset of, okay, let's figure out who the funders are. And it just took off and got much bigger than we ever expected.
The core area for both of you, for both of the campaigns of Sleeping Giant and now with Check My Ad and with Stop Hate, is really to alert advertisers to hateful content. But hate can be very subjective, right? It's something that I think hateful, others may not consider it to be hateful. So what is the sort of, how did you go about defining the content that you would be flagging? When you guys began in 2016, how did you define what hateful content will be, and what is the sort of content that you would accept as sensational, maybe not really healthy for news consumers to consume, but still okay, versus the sort of content that is outright problematic and something that you should be flagging advertisers for? What is how did you guys go about defining that? Nandini, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So we did not start out with any kind of plan. Breitbart was just the biggest purveyor of the type of content that I described. And they were doing a really good job of helping those stories enter the mainstream. And that was something that we felt was overall dangerous. The question you ask around how to tell I guess draw the line and understand where it becomes sort of unacceptable. That's an interesting one. That's something that is debated a lot. I mean, there's some characteristics, and I think Richard might agree, of what a hate site is. Most notably, they engage in a pattern of deception over time, as well as narratives that don't seem to serve journalistic purposes. So they don't seek to inform, but they seek to make you angry about something like a nebulous, group, scapegoating a certain ethnic group, for example, or scapegoating or othering a group of people. If you find yourself after reading one of these articles feeling that a group of people that you don't know, bound by something like religion or ethnicity, is your enemy, or if they are a problem, that is something that I would say is a defining factor of propaganda.
If I could just come in, there's a couple of really good examples from the UK. I say really good examples, I mean really bad examples, to be honest. In 2015, the United Nations actually put out a statement condemning the UK tabloid press for hate speech, and the trigger for this was that a columnist in the Sun newspaper, which at the time was Britain's top-selling newspaper, wrote an article comparing African migrants to cockroaches. Yeah. And that demonization, particularly that dehumanization, is something that's really striking, that you actually see around the world. That whether it was in Rwanda in the genocide, where actually Tutsi people were compared to cockroaches, that comparison of human beings to animals is a real kind of almost universal feature of hate that you tend to see around the world. So that's one of the easier things to spot. I think, as Nandini says, sometimes it can be a lot more subtle than that and a lot more insidious. But the other one that I would highlight was where we started in the UK, was with this overwhelming surge of front page stories with the word migrant. Overwhelmingly, those messages were negative. So when you have a publication that every single time, or almost every single time, it talks about a particular group of people, whether it's Muslims, whether it's migrants, whether it's people from the LGBT community, if every headline is aligning that group with crime, with violence, with negative things, then the cumulative effect of that absolutely is hateful and harmful. And that would be the other sort of key thing that I would highlight as the more extreme version that you can start to focus on.
So interesting what you say. You'd be surprised, or maybe not surprised, to know that Katie Hopkins often comes on two famous Indian news channels, Republican Times now, as a British analyst and an expert. And these channels, of course, have also been called out a lot of times for some of the content that they put out on minorities. And I think the point about cockroaches is quite interesting, because often on Indian news televisions also you hear words like termite, words like cockroaches or vermin being used for a particular religious group or an ethnicity. And I think we saw this during the coronavirus also, where there were a group of Muslim, it was sort of an organization that was blamed for the spread of coronavirus. So they were called Corona bombs or Corona jihadis and stuff like that. So that kind of stuff would be outright, you'd flag that right away in the US or UK if you saw content like that.
Absolutely. And it's even, that kind of language of rats and snakes. The other thing, the point to make is that, in some of the most notorious episodes of history, the Nazi press of the 1930s was literally using those same terms. So it's a kind of, unfortunately, it's a lesson from history that if we want to stop those sorts of things recurring again, we need to focus on that kind of language and that kind of symbolism.
But just on one question I had, and both of you could take it, is there like a global understanding though, like you said, there was a UN charter that came out, but is there, when it comes to hate speech in the media, are there some guidelines issued by the UN or any other body that you guys go by? Or is it country to country stuff that UK has evolved to come to understand as hate speech, or stuff that would be considered hate speech in the US?
There is a set of global standards. The thing to sort of caveat it is that the concept of hate speech is an emerging concept within sort of UN discourse. But there was a document produced called the Rabat Plan of Action, which is an attempt to kind of map out a framework for defining and understanding hate speech, which is Googleable. It's not the most memorable name, but it's the Rabat Plan of Action. There's a series of international agreements that started essentially after the Second World War. And that, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, I think, has language in it that talks about incitement. But we don't yet have a sort of single, unified, globally agreed definition. What we have is a sort of cluster of concepts. So there isn't one single one, but equally it's not entirely subjective either. There are some kind of core characteristics that you can draw, and dehumanization would be one example of that.
Dehumanizing would be one of the prime ways by which you could identify hateful propaganda on television. Now, both of you, Nandini, you're aware a bit about the scene in India when it comes to hate speech in media. And I know that Stop Hate has also picked up a few campaigns. There was an article by Op India that you guys flagged to advertisers. What are the sort of, given your experience in the UK and US, and I guess Nandini could take this first, given your experience in the US, do you see a commonality with the kind of content that you probably read in Breitbart to the sort of stuff that you're probably reading in India or watching in India? Is there anything that strikes you as similar in terms of hateful propaganda in the media?
Yeah, I would say that there's a term for this called adversarial narratives, where again, you're not looking at a single story, but you're looking at the cumulative effect of multiple stories over time, and the effect that they have on the way that you see the world. And I think both. I think the website that we targeted was Op India, and Breitbart have that in common. They're committed to picking out story angles, headlines, photos, using a certain kind of language to develop a narrative that is, again, designed to elicit a certain kind of emotional response from their readership, which you then see reflected in the comment section on their websites or on Twitter or on other platforms. And they use that as a feedback loop, so they continue to get the audience angry, the audience continues to engage, and then they write more stories and continue to build on that audience and continue to build on that narrative. It feels just real enough that these audiences believe they're informed, they're better informed, and that they are when they're citing this article, that they're citing the news, and that makes them in some sense an authority on the subject. But of course, that is that's all manufactured by these media organizations.
I think, just to add to that, our experience with Stop Funding Hate has been a very strange journey, because we started off mostly looking at what was going on in the UK, and then these people called Sleeping Giants got in touch, and they said, "Oh, have you seen this website in the US? Look, this is really hateful stuff on Breitbart." And then some people from Denmark started a campaign, and then some people from France started doing it. And what we've gradually realized is that all over the world in the last 10 years, there's been a rise of a certain kind of online website, whether it's Breitbart in the UK or in the US or Op India in India, that seems to follow the same kind of model and seems to be funded, when almost always it seems to be funded by online advertising, and not just online advertising, but specifically Google advertising. And what gradually emerged for us was a realization that this is actually happening everywhere. It's happening everywhere at the same time. And I remember a couple of years ago, someone contacted me from India, and they would just said, "Oh, there are all these websites, and they publish in the local language, and they target these groups, and they pick on these divisions, and they push these kinds of fake narratives." And it was it was almost like deja vu, because it was so similar to what I'd heard from so many other countries. And what I suppose where I've got to is that actually, if you're asking yourself, why is it that in the last 10 years, there has been this global surge in all forms of hate and racism, not just in one country or even in one continent, but in multiple countries simultaneously, whether that's Brazil or US or across Europe or India? It's because of online advertising. Everywhere that the Google AdSense network has rolled out, you've then seen a market that's been created for a way to make money by peddling hateful clickbait. So it's kind of like, I think we've talked about this before, almost like a McDonaldization of hate. It's like the franchise model of hate, whether it's, and I think Opindia's even compared itself to be the sort of Indian version of Breitbart. So there's even awareness around that among the groups that are doing this. And I think that's, for me, that suddenly when I saw that, that was when it all sort of seemed to make sense as a kind of global issue.
So coming back to ads and brands, that's really at the center of this. Two questions. One, in your experience, Nandini, usually you look at brands and you look at big companies and you look at, big names in advertising. They don't want to really bother themselves with the moral aspect of whatever, it is that they're doing. So companies typically don't want to take on the moral burden of what they're promoting or what they're not. They typically don't, even though they want us to believe that they, a big thrust of advertising is to tell everyone how good they are. But the general notion is that they don't really care about the moral aspect of, their operations. So how receptive, by and large, have big advertisements and companies been to your campaign? Do they recognize this as a problem? Do they recognize this as their responsibility? And also when it comes to big tech like Google, Google AdSense, do they recognize that, this model is fundamentally broken because you're pushing on ads to sites that, you can't really vouch for? What has your experience been when it comes to interacting with big brands?
So to answer that question, you have to remember that we started this campaign right after the elections, and people felt there was just a lot of emotion in this country, and people were, I think, in just kind of a uniquely like a place of hurt, right? And brands would have done anything to get away from the association of hate and the Trump campaign and any of that stuff. It was just a really critical time, is what I'm trying to say. Brands were immediately receptive to what we did here in the States. I think one of the first big companies to come out was Kellogg's. Kellogg's told us that they were not aware that their ads were on Breitbart, and that they would audit their entire ad spend to ensure that they don't appear on hate speech. It was an opportunity for that company to come out and say, to reassert their values to the public. It resulted in a lot of good press for them. And it also paved the way for other brands to be able to say the same thing, to feel a little bit more strong about coming out and saying the same thing. And it was lucky that Kellogg's is obviously a big company. They can handle criticism. Excuse me. They can handle that criticism. Breitbart actually ended up launching I think it was something like boycott Kellogg's, some kind of a hashtag campaign. Excuse me.
I think it was even a war on Kellogg's. I definitely saw a war on Kellogg's.
Yeah, there were like millions of cereal-loving Breitbart readers have been offended by Kellogg's refusal to advertise with us, or something like that. So there was a little bit of fear that you could end up in the crosshairs of some sort of like right left campaign or whatever, but no, that didn't happen. That was such a stupid boycott. The only thing it did was make us stronger. We got some of our first international headlines as a result of ill-planned campaign, and then brands just wanted to jump on this boat. So it really was. It was just the timing was right, and brands understood. It was a very simple concept. Our ads are on this website because of Google, and we can just all we have to do is go in and turn off that ad. Yeah, sure, that seems like an easy thing to do and an easy way to score points. Now, what has happened since then? What's happened is that these brands have realized that they're on Breitbart, or they have blocked Breitbart, but they don't know all the other sites that they're on that are similar to Breitbart, that are having the same corrosive effect on our society, not only here in the US, but around the world. Because remember, when you turn on your Google ads, and I personally visit a lot of hate sites around the world, and I am followed around by some of the shoe brands or whatever that I'm looking at. So it's a massive global issue, and no one brand can keep track of all these terrible websites around the world. They're in different languages, different countries. What I have found is that companies are still not aware of the scope of the problem. They thought, like I did, just a year ago, I thought it was just a matter of taking care of a handful of problem sites, but no, that's not how this works at all. Oftentimes, some of the worst sort of narratives start to take hold in small sites on the internet, right? Like really small niche sites where they strengthen, where they grow, where they incubate a little bit, and then they move on to the bigger sites. So you have to have this understanding. But of course, what marketer is going to sit here and study disinformation? That's not what we're here to do, right? We're here to sell our stuff. So really, what we're trying to do now, what I'm trying to do now is educate brands that this is not just about one website. This is about an entire ecosystem. And what brands have to do now is to start holding their vendors accountable for where their ads are being placed. Because what we as marketers did was we put our trust in third parties who told us, hey, we're going to take care of your brand. We're going to make sure that you appear on premium websites, and then they go off and put it on some of the worst places on the internet. So the problem hasn't been solved. Marketers are aware that bad sites exist, and they think that it's largely being taken care of by someone else, and it's not. And that's that bigger problem that I'm still working on addressing.
Just a quick question, just a follow-up question. Do you see brands responding differently in different countries? Because you guys did have a chapter in Brazil, you've done some work in India. Do you see them easily upholding certain values in liberal democracies like the US or UK? Because there are certain established ways of public discourse which you may not have in countries like India or Brazil. Do you see them react differently to different countries and different cultures, and what's your experience been? Are they more responsive when it comes to, say, liberal democracy versus a sort of a younger democracy like India?
I'm going to let Richard take that one, because I know you've been talking advertising.
I mean, it's hard to sort of make a scientific assessment, but I have to say, in India, with Op India, we saw, I'd almost call it a stampede of brands from across the world, some of them Indian, some of them global brands. I don't think I saw a single brand who seemed happy to be aligned with that kind of content. I think one difference maybe between countries is, in a lot of cases, brands won't want to necessarily publicize the fact that they've excluded that toxic website from their ads, but they'll still do it behind the scenes, and that's fine, right? So I think it may be that in the Indian context, there's been more of that kind of quietly backing away because not everyone wants to get into a firefight like Kellogg's did. But overall, to be honest, what's really struck me is that this way of campaigning seems to work everywhere, and that's the positive story. That actually the tactic that Sleeping Giants pioneered and that Stop Funding Hate cheerfully and happily is happy to acknowledge that we've copied and used, it's so empowering, and it seems to work everywhere. It draws on the power that we all have as consumers, and we've seen it start to work in India. I've seen it happening all across Europe, and in some ways it suggests that actually there is a really strong element of universality to this tactic.
What is the when it comes to countries in Europe and UK, do you see a difference there in terms of how brands react, or different thresholds to hate speech? Would you say like a German brand would be, way more careful because of the history of the country than say compared to a brand in UK or a brand in US? Do you see like cultural difference within Europe or the West?
One thing that's really striking, I would say, is different types of hate play out differently in different places. So, for example, in Poland, we're seeing a lot of hate against LGBT community, whereas in India, there seems to be a lot of anti-Muslim hate. In Britain, it's been anti-migrant hate. So the hate seems to play out differently. But I don't know a single company that's happy to be aligned with any form of hate, right? I mean,
that's heartening to know, because I mean, one would imagine that they don't really care, but it's heartening to know that when in your experience and all the campaigns that you've run, you found companies to not want to associate themselves with.
I think there's two levels to it. So companies, in my experience, they don't ever want to be seen to be getting into a political argument. But if you are a mainstream brand and your job is to sell shoes, or let's say to as many people as possible, why would you want to alienate an entire section of your customer base by helping to fuel hate against the community they're part of? And one of the things we've seen with Stop Funding Hate is that when somebody goes to a company that they shop with and they say, this, someone who's trans say, this content that you're funding with your advertising is fueling hate towards people like me. That is a very hard message for a brand to brush off, because that's kind of like saying they don't really care what their customers think. So for me, that's another element of the universality. The hate may look different in different places, and it may be that different messages work differently with different brands. But the fundamental point is brands don't really want to be fueling hate against their own customers.
Yeah, I would also add to that, there's a lot of internal politics happening when someone like Stop Funding Hate or Sleeping Giants tweets at your brand. What happens is if the brand has an agency that they have outsourced their advertising to, and a lot of them had and still do.
Yeah. In our experience, I mean, Newslaundry runs this little series. A lot of the time, brands are just not aware.
They're just not aware.
They say that it's an agency that deals with it. So, like,
honestly, even if they're doing their own advertising in-house, most marketers are not aware, because nobody's checking their site placements. They're just looking at their impressions, their clicks, their conversion rates, sales, and so on. The average person's not looking at their site list. So across the board, nobody knows where their ads are going. But what happens is, you get in trouble with your customers on social media, a very public and embarrassing place to be found out that way. And people start getting in trouble, right? Heads start to roll. And it gives me no pleasure to say this, but I found out later in this campaign that people lost their jobs over their Breitbart ads or similar campaigns. And I mean, it sucks, because those people probably just weren't aware that this could be an issue. I certainly wasn't, and I've spent my career in marketing. So it sucks, but there's like, that's what's happening here. People are afraid that their boss is going to find out. So there's and that boss doesn't want to take, a problem like this to their boss. Nobody wants a problem like this to escalate. And that's why brands responded so quickly, because nobody wants to get in trouble and nobody wants to lose their job, and no one wants to get their performance review dinged because they weren't doing their job properly. So it's a combination of what Richard said, plus all the internal politics and drama that takes place within a company.
So we're having this conversation at a very interesting point in India, where we've just last weekend had this controversy with Bloomsbury, where they published a book on Delhi riots, which was in late January. There was violence in Delhi. Over 50 people lost their lives. It was, you could call it a communal riot between two communities. So this book was supposed to be on the riots, and it has a lot of falsehood and misinformation, a lot of conspiracy theories. It's a bit like Katie Hopkins writing a book on immigration, so that level of conspiracies. And of course, there was a lot of backlash from within India, from mostly, people of liberal persuasion. And the publisher pulled back; they pulped the book. Now, I just want there's a criticism to this kind of activism that both Sleeping Giant and Stop Hate do, and this is what we witnessed in Bloomsbury's case over the past weekend in India. That criticism is one that you're forcing your sensibilities on us, and that this is somehow against free speech because there's another narrative that someone wants to put out, and there's a bunch of publishers, or in the case of brands, there are a bunch of brands who don't mind supporting that narrative, and you're just crushing that narrative because you don't. You're politically different or you're ideologically different. So it's basically the attack of the left liberal ideology on right wing. How do you respond to this? Because I'm sure you guys get this a lot, that you're just forcing your sensibilities on people who don't share your sensibilities.
Well, they can always blog about it. They can always tweet out their conspiracy theories. They can print it out they can self-publish and then mail it out to their customers. So who's taking away their right to free speech? What that publisher is doing, and Bloomsbury is a big publisher, is they're trying to save their own asses and they're trying to protect their own brand. They're a private company and they're entitled to do it. On the flip side, can I say that Bloomsbury is censoring me when they don't offer me a book deal? Do they owe everybody a book deal? Do they have to, do they have to work with everyone? No, they get to choose who they do business with. And on the flip side, I don't think whoever is writing that book is going to jail over what they wrote. And they're still free to find other avenues to publish. I support their right to do that. They should. And if they can find their advertisers who want to support them, then, Godspeed. But the idea that their free speech is being denied to them is a bad faith argument, because they can continue to say what they want. All we're saying is you're not entitled to advertiser dollars and you're not entitled to a publisher.
And I think that's very much the view that we would say, but also it's in the case, it's up to brands where they advertise. Brands have the freedom to advertise where they want to. If they want to give lots of money to Breitbart or Op India and they want to put their ads there, then they can. Equally, if they prefer to put their advertising in places where people aren't being demonized and dehumanized, then that's also a choice that the brand can take. So we would say, well, like Nandini says, that no one's saying, people are free to say what they like, print what they like within the law. Advertisers are free to choose whether they fund it or not. And actually also supporters of Stop Funding Hate are free to use their freedom of expression to have a conversation with the companies they shop with about that issue. Free speech is for everybody. And one of the things that's actually really good about the model of campaigning that Sleeping Giants and Stop Funding Hate both do is that this offers a way to challenge hate without having to get into the law. And I totally agree that, going down a legal route can have unintended consequences, and it can cause problems and it can have implications for freedom of speech. But actually just using your power as consumers, that's a sort of tactic for civic engagement and public expression that has a long tradition around the world, including in India, hundreds of years ago, people were campaigning against slavery by boycotting sugar producers that used slaves on their plantations. This is just a tradition that we're carrying on in the digital age.
Okay, so we have about like 5 minutes left now, so I have 2 quick questions. One is now the other argument against a campaign like this is also that when you campaign for someone's deplatforming, or when you campaign for someone's boycott, in this case maybe a hateful website, and you're campaigning for brands to boycott them, you end up making heroes out of them, or you end up amplifying them further. So, for example, I mean, I'm going back to the Bloomsbury case where there was an argument from the liberal section that you can campaign, for this, but what you end up doing is that you end up publicizing the book further. So, in your case, you end up publicizing the website further, or you end up publicizing the news site that's publishing, maybe Breitbart further. So, what has your experience been in this case? Has it been counterproductive at times? Do you sometimes end up making celebrities out of hate mongers when you because they have their own fan base?
Never. I don't really understand that argument. You have to bring attention to something in order to solve the problem. Yes, technically going to Breitbart, for Sleeping Giants followers, going to Breitbart did technically increase their traffic, but it also lost them 90% of their ad revenues. So I don't really understand what the argument there is. There is a figure here named Milo Yiannopoulos, who's actually from the UK, so he's both our problems. And he's, I think, sort of the perfect example of that sort of tears down this idea of giving them attention, glorifies them. Milo has been deplatformed from nearly every major social media network. He's been consigned to using, I think, Telegram. He had a book deal as well, I think, with Simon & Schuster, and I think that was a publisher, and then he lost that. And I'm so glad to say I never think about him. Like, I forgot this guy exists. Every so often there's an article about him being deeply in debt because he can't sustain his lifestyle. And other than that, I don't think about him. A lot of us don't think about him anymore. He's really sort of like a perfect example of what happens when a company loses the platform that it was given by these companies to begin with.
Richard?
Yeah,
you ended up being a celebrity of Katie Hopkins.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, actually, we've always been a little bit mindful of this because, I mean, there's 2 levels to it. So we always try to kind of say, look, our problem is with calling out African migrants cockroaches. It's the behavior that is problematic. And one thing we were mindful of, which is a slightly different question, is if one columnist moves on and goes somewhere else and they're not in the top selling newspaper anymore, unless you also address the underlying reasons why that columnist was publishing that stuff in the first place, another columnist can step in and start pumping out exactly the same messages. So we've always had this sense that it's not actually so much about the individuals, because you can always find someone who's going to pump out hate. So that would be more our angle. I mean, but I think what Nandini said is absolutely true, that if you actually look at the examples of people that did have a massive platform and now they don't have a massive platform anymore, they don't have the same reach that they used to. So it's just not true that in general, challenging individuals that push that hateful message actually makes them stronger. I think, but what I would say is that alongside doing that, and this is, I think, why the model that we're talking about is so powerful, it's also important that you then undermine the basis of why that stuff was profitable in the first place by talking to advertisers, by getting greater consciousness and awareness of the clickbait problem as well. So I guess you've got to look at both sides of it.
So in both your cases, you haven't found that to be true. Okay,
I'm
last question.
An example. I can't think of a single one.
Sorry?
I can't think of a single person who's come out stronger from our campaigns. So, okay. If that helps.
Okay, I just wanted to, before we conclude our discussion, I wanted to touch on something that both of you touched on earlier in the conversation on the business of advertising, funding news really. And central to a lot of this issue is that news is heavily dependent on advertising. And when you are very dependent on advertising, what you end up doing is you end up catering to mindless clicks. Sometimes you end up catering to a market. You may find hate to be profitable and you just cater to that because you need those ads. How do you see there to be a fundamental problem with news dependency on ads? Do you think the model is broken and there needs to be a better model out there? Or, is that something that you guys also think about because you deal with so much of news content?
The thing about ad-funded news is that it is one of the oldest business relationships around. The news is something that everyone needs, and advertising subsidizes the publication of the news. I'm a big fan of some of the member-supported news organizations. I think Newslaundry is also one of them.
Yes,
where you're sort of, and it's great because you are then beholden to your readers. What I think about a lot is how to make news accessible to everyone. And there's different ways of doing it. So some outlets might make their news available only to their readers. Others might have paid readers subsidize everyone else. There's no one way to do it. What I concern myself with is how to make reliable quality information available to all. So as long as we're able to, because I'm already seeing in some sense of a society being created where people with money are able to access good information and everyone else has to sort of rely on clickbait. So we don't want that kind of society either. So I think that there is a happy medium between subscription and member-supported organizations, as well as there is a place for brands and advertisers to develop partnerships, not just through advertising, potentially through other means as well, through sponsorships, through putting on events together. There's a lot of different revenue channels, revenue streams that I think are possible.
I also agree that some of the newest and most innovative news organizations that we're seeing now are driven by a different model. And I think that's really important. And I'm really hoping that that's going to grow. Equally, I think there are big things that could be done that would make quite a big improvement to the current sort of ad-funded news environment. I think overall advertising is something like $600 billion US dollars a year worldwide. So if there could be a way that could be found to shift even 10% of that money away from the toxic clickbait and towards good quality responsible journalism, the potential for change is enormous. And there are a couple of initiatives that I would mention actually. The first is a UK started initiative called the Conscious Advertising Network. Actually, the last time Nandini and I were on the same panel was an event organized by our friends at the Conscious Advertising Network. And that is simply about having a basic set of kind of standards that advertisers can sign up to, which just govern the sort of ethical principles that they use when they're doing their advertising. So they still got to meet a business objective, but the idea is that if you have a kind of basic ethical code, similar to other models that have been used with other sort of industries in the last sort of 30, 40 years or so, then, if there's just a basic check, for example, we won't fund media that fuel genocide, for example, or we won't fund media that push dehumanization. And if that's rolled out on a large enough scale, that could have quite a big, powerful systemic effect. And then there's another initiative from an organization, Reporters Without Borders, called the Journalism Trust Initiative. And it's really interesting because they're coming up with a kind of a global kite mark standard to define what responsible media looks like. But at the same time as they're doing that, they're talking to advertisers to say it would, there's a way that you could use your advertising to kind of prioritize supporting media that have achieved this kite marking standard. And again, if enough big advertisers were to adopt that, you could really come up with a kind of a framework that would not only take money away from the bad, but it would also give vital support to the sort of really good quality responsible journalism, which is also the solution to misinformation and hate news. So I think I'm actually quite hopeful that, messy though the current situation is, there are solutions coming through which will actually help to solve a big part of the problem if they take hold on a large enough scale.
Great. Thank you so much. Where at times it's up. It's been up for a while now. But thanks, Richard and Nandini. I think this is a conversation that we really need to have in India for newsreaders to scrutinize advertisement more closely, to look at who's funding their news and what their news is telling them. At Newslaundry, we have this series called Bloodlust TV, where we flag out content that's hateful. We call out advertisers that are funding hateful primetime shows. And I think it's really something that news consumers in India need to wake up to. And I'd say that also step in and support media which doesn't depend on advertising, like Newslaundry, that really works to uphold public interest rather than what may seem interesting to the public. So support Newslaundry, pay to keep news free, and thank you so much, Nandini and Richard, for joining us. That was really enlightening. I hope you guys had some interesting takeaways from this conversation.
So thanks, Richard. Thanks, Nandini, and thank you, Manisha. I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. This is something that Manisha and I have been speaking out on for a long time. We wish you could have been here, but COVID unfortunately hasn't made that possible. But next time at Media Rumble, we really hope you can get here and we can have a more engaged conversation and some to and fro with an audience, because that's when we can really get this conversation going. We hope the audience enjoyed this session as much as Manisha and I clearly did. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, the audience, for joining us. Just want to tell you that there's a stand-up act where Abhijit Ganguly and Aditi Mittal will take the news industry to the cleaners. We do hope you'll join us. The book tickets are available on Book My Show. So we are going to culminate this entire series of conversations on the news industry with a stand-up act where they will hopefully take the news industries to the cleaners, including us, because as we say, sabki dhulai. Thank you to all the producers, the entire team. Stay tuned for more information. Again, do follow us at the Media Rumble on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and stay updated on all our sessions. Thank you again for a wonderful evening.